Abdolreza Abbassian. He's the economist at the Food and Agricultural Organization. They're a UN body, and very recently they said that the food price shock that we're seeing globally is one of the worst in recent times, and it could hit crisis levels. Mr. Abbassian, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to have you here on NDTV Profit. Let me just first get your basic assessment of the situation. We've seen a fairly alarming comment saying that this is one of the worst food price shocks. We are near crisis levels. Is that the way you still characterize it?
Well, we are certainly experiencing a price shock globally. The prices we refer to and our food price index, which was published for December just recently, captures international prices. So let's be very clear about that. So the international prices of raw material for agricultural commodities have really peaked, one could say, to almost a near all-time high. And this cannot be a very comforting situation, obviously, especially for countries which import food and they are poor. So there is a concern, but what I would characterize the current situation is certainly a very important price shock, and unfortunately with no relief yet in sight. And that is where I guess there is definitely a legitimate worrying on that aspect.
All right, so but you know, if you just sort of divide the situation, the commodities where we are seeing increases, things like soya, things like corn. So yes, it is worrying, but the two staples as they are known, rice and wheat, have not seen such a dramatic increase. So should we take some comfort in that fact that rice and wheat prices haven't moved up that dramatically?
Absolutely, and this is something that often is failed to be mentioned. One of the drivers for the problems we saw in 2007 and 2008 was indeed the rice situation. Not only in terms of its drawdown stocks and shortages and high prices there, but also the government policies later on, which led to restrictions of exports of the food staples such as rice and wheat. I think that the rice situation and wheat situation fare much better than the other commodities, especially in importing countries such as India and China, which are very important markets for rice and also for wheat. Having said that, there is also another positive factor that is often not discussed. Many countries, especially in Africa, have had very good, if not record harvests of corn, and that makes it a little bit easier for them to, I guess, go through this difficult period by not relying on the world market to import corn at very punitive prices. So there are these very, I would say, positive signs. However, we have to put that in perspective. The longer prices remain high for other commodities, the spillover effect will simply push and pull prices of other commodities higher. If you look at the food inflation in different countries, in the especially developing world, is increasing almost everywhere, and that is not to include rice and wheat, which have gone up, but not that much, but other food commodities. So this could really put some strain on countries, and eventually, if this thing goes on for too long, it could lead to countries even making policy decisions that could have negative implications for also rice and wheat markets.
All right, so you're saying that there could be a spillover effect into rice and wheat prices, and also if there are knee-jerk reactions such as banning of exports, etc., that could exacerbate the situation globally speaking. So things could worsen from here. That seems to be the message. So specifically about India, what are you making of the situation in India? Is this some sort of a temporary spike? We are saying it's about perishables and unseasonal rains, so it'll sort itself out. But in a slightly more medium term, is this situation getting worsened because we haven't paid enough attention to storage, delivery, and the PDS system, actually?
I think one has to really, we use the names of countries as they're all the same. I mean, India is a huge country, it's a continent. China is another one. So managing these huge countries, obviously, is not the same as managing in a small country. When we look at the inflation in India, and in particular, if you look at the food inflation in India, what you see is that, in fact, it's not coming from some of the basic foods such as staples such as rice or wheat, but it's coming, let's say, from vegetables, from onions, from spices. And what does that tell you is that this strong economic growth shared today in India, China, and many other developing countries is really increasing the appetite of the consumers, and these consumers today can actually afford better food, more value-added food, even at higher prices. The problem is the equality here, because in all these countries, there is more and more, because of the economic growth, sections which can afford the higher prices, and this will prevent prices to actually, it prevents rationing and therefore prevents prices to correct themselves, while there will be also a growing number of people who will be left behind. So I think this is where governments' policies and targeted to help those who cannot afford high prices come into the picture. And I think that we are now moving into a system or situation where a lot of countries are going to really see this as a very important challenge to correct in the future.
All right, so there are policy issues that need to be tackled internally in India, and we've seen some noises from the Prime Minister's office, nothing more than that. Just getting back to the global picture, so what are you saying should be the response, the global response to this crisis?
One of the things that is the only thing that you could say was predicted, in fact, is the fact that from 2005-06 onwards, we've been saying that the world has to live with higher prices, and that the idea that we're going to get back to the cheap food era is over, and I think this confirms it. Then came 2007 and 8 shock, and I think, again, many countries, just old habits, die hard. They felt that the price rise was a temporary phenomenon, and that soon again they will be able to go to the world market and import at cheaper prices like in the past. And I think this event now shows that this is certainly not going to be the case. And I think the future events, as we will go on, we will see that we probably look back actually to these days and say, well, food was even cheap in this period in comparison. So what this means is that there has been some structural changes in the demand side, and there are some, I wouldn't say structural change in the supply, but in what we supply. As people, as I mentioned, would be eating more value-added food, there would be a shift towards those foods. As farmers will look into relative returns, they choose the crop they want to harvest, they want to plant, they go and choose that crop. They're not going to respond to government, they're going to respond to markets. All of this means that we are in a different setup to the one we were used to in the 1950s and 60s. Obviously, going back to what we had is not a solution, because part of the reason today we have problems in developing countries is exactly because of the bad policies of the past, that the rich countries managed to actually produce more, but with the subsidies, and then they dumped it in the developing countries, and developing countries wouldn't produce for themselves because it was relatively more expensive. So that solution cannot do. So what we need today to do, above everything else, is to get the kind of a market that we believe will function, if we know what it is, functions. And that already is not doing that. I mean, that's the bare minimum we need to do. We need to make this market transparent. We need to know who are the real actors. And we need to know where and how food is bought, procured, and distributed. And above all, how the prices are determined.
All right, so we need clearer markets, clearer policies, and at the end of the day, perhaps we have to adjust expectations because prices will stay high. Last question, sir. Wondering whether the fuel price increase is going to exacerbate the situation to an extent at the retail end as transportation costs, etc., start to add up?
One of the significant differences between this episode and 2007 and 8 is the fact that at least energy costs much less than it was then. But energy cost is an important factor in the cost of food, not only in the form of fertilizer, which very much has a very strong correlation with energy, but in terms of transport. And I think that, yes, if we were to assume that we're going to have a return to a stronger growth, I think World Bank just this week came up with numbers for 2011, and it slightly reduced the global growth rates from the previous projection, but it's still above 3% growth. And it's saying that China and India, for example, they will get actually a bigger share of that growth in 2011. What does that tell you is that the demand for petroleum in these countries, especially emerging countries and those in Asia in particular, are going to rise even faster. So as petrol is now reaching about $100, I think most analysts believe that that would be just the beginning and prices will rise even further. This is not a scenario that would be very supportive of a grain market returning to any, or food markets returning to any normal level. This simply would aggravate the situation further, and I think at every level of the value chain, energy will play a very strong and I would say influential role.
All right, Mr. Abbassian, thank you so much for actually making the time to speak with us and giving us some of those key takeaways, and slightly worrying takeaways actually, because the message from the FAO is that the era of cheap food is over. We should brace ourselves for even higher food prices from here on. Not good news for a country like India.